topic is Johannes Kirchmayer of Bavaria and Arlington, master woodcarver. And our speaker this evening is Doreen Stevens, who is the co-author of Arlington's Cultural Heights and is the former director of the Arlington Historical Society and is currently on the Old Schwamb Mills Board of Directors. So without further ado, here is Doreen Stevens.
Okay, Doreen.
Hello, everybody. Is everything working technologically okay, Durham?
I just would like to highlight you if you can unshare your screen for a second. And if you can just say a word, Doreen.
Sure, a word.
All right, just a second.
Can I go ahead? Oh, there I am. Okay.
There you go, Doreen. Thank you.
Okay. I want to say hi to everybody, and it's great to see you, but it would even be nicer if we were all together physically in the old Schwamb Mill, and I hope that all happens soon. I also want to thank Ed for polishing the title of this particular talk. I told him I was going to talk about Johannes Kirchmayer, the woodcarver, and I think he was afraid that people would think it was going to be a half hour about chisels or something. So it's got a rather complete, lengthy but complete title. John Kirchmayer, master woodcarver of Bavaria and of Arlington. And all of those things are true. And as long as I'm thanking folks, let me thank a few more. Back a decade ago, perhaps more, Patsy Kramer and Richard Duffy, who were the program coordinators at the Arlington Historical Society, invited Shirley Prouty, a hometown girl, she grew up in Arlington, to come and talk about her illustrious ancestor, Johannes Kirchmayer, who was her great-great-grand uncle. And her father, in fact, had grown up knowing Kirchmayer very well, part of in and out of the grandparents' life, part of his life, and called him mon uncle, as she reports in her book. It's a lovely big coffee table book with lots of beautiful colored photographs. And then later when Amy Taberner and Sarah Burks and myself got ready to investigate the Arlington Heights cultural community and write our book, we delved deeper into the story of Johannes Kirchmayer. So I'd like to thank all those folks. History is written by a village of historians, and just as we all know in this day and age that after the 1619 project, that there's yet another village historians that have joined the community. It's good to thank all these folks that have helped with previous research. Johannes Kirchmayer was 6'1", a great big Bavarian, strong with big hands and a haystack of a hairdo. When he was young, when he first came to the States, he also had a brown curly beard, and he always had that wonderful mustache. He was born in 1860 and died in 1930. He was known as the finest carver of wood in America. I don't know that it means today what it meant back in his era. Wood carving is not people don't seek out exhibits on liturgical wood carving, but I think you'll agree if you look at these examples of his work that it was beautiful. And it was always meant, carvings that are made for ecclesiastical purposes were meant to harmonize with the surroundings, with the environment. They weren't supposed to jump out at you like a Jackson Pollock or that was at the same time, if you spend the time and really do look, you'll see how exquisitely detailed and personable and individual each one, and come perhaps as I have to really relish an opportunity to spend some time with wood carvings. This is an example for folks that are local. For us, our big local artistic celebrity in the past was Cyrus Dallin, who produced the Appeal to the Great Spirit in front of the Museum of Fine Arts and Boston's iconic statue that all of America knows about, which is Paul Revere on his horse in the North End. But in 1900 and for a decade thereafter, it was the greater artist of the two. The one that folks would have known about was Johannes Kirchmayer, not Cyrus Dallin. And this is an example of one of his works, which was exhibited in the rotunda of the Museum of Fine Arts as a singular entity, as a work of art. It was destined to be part of the Cathedral Church of St. Paul in Detroit, but for a while it was exhibited to great acclaim. The critics writing about Kirchmayer around the turn of the century, it's almost as if he's set apart and in total awe, and often he's called, the Kirchmayer, or something like the Great Kirchmayer. He was born, as every single article or book about him indicates, born in Oberammergau, which is a smallish town in the Bavarian Alps, hard by the Austrian border. It is known far and wide as the place where the Passion Play occurs every 10 years. In Kirchmayer's time, maybe even today, I've never seen it. It was an extravaganza of incredible proportions. So a town of, say, 4,000 people, half of them would be in the play, and there'd be these great tableaux, and children would be involved, and it took 8 hours with sometimes a lunch break. It was the town did it as a promise to God after God spared them after a plague in the 1600s. And it's been produced every 10 years thereafter, with the exception of maybe a couple world wars, and of course 2020, when we once again are faced with a plague of incredible magnitude. The other claim to fame, and it's perhaps even predated the Passion Play, was Oberammergau's the renown that its wood carvers held. In fact, the wood carvers were so well regarded in the town, in Europe in general, but in the town also in particular, that they were often, it was from the wood carvers that the most important characters in the Passion Play usually were from that group, that the Passion Play, like Christos was chosen from the wood carvers. So it was, there was a great heritage and a whole backpack full of expectations and history that Johannes Kirchmayer carried with him when he left his small village. He studied, he was such a good student, so good at drawing, so good at art, that he was sent to study for further study several times in his youth in Augsburg and in Munich. And then he also ended up for a period of time in both Paris and in London, which I all wish we were able to duplicate in this particular moment in time. In 1883, he came to the United States, to Gilded Age America, part of our history when there was a great divide between the very, very rich and the very, very poor, perhaps duplicated in the early 2020s as we experience our life now. It was a country that was bursting at the seams with this great wealth, this new parvenu class, this nouveau riche group of people that were the robber barons, the J.P. Morgans, the Carnegies, the Fords, the people who had learned to harness the incredible industrial might of America and its material resources, and then pocketed the change. It was also a time of great labor strife, a time of incredible immigration, a time of incredible urbanization, just a complex, tumultuous period in American history. But when John Kirchmayer was on his boat coming into New York Harbor, one of the things that struck him and stuck in his mind was the sight of all those skyscrapers. And later, when he was asked to characterize the kind of sculpture that he did and that he developed over time, he talked about his American Gothic that was in part based on the elongation of his carvings that mimicked the skyscrapers that he saw when he first came into New York Harbor. He first worked for Anthony Kimball or Kimball and Sons, and they produced the kind of Gothic revival cabinetry that the black and white picture shows, kind of heavy and dark and not particularly to my taste. But he then shortly also worked with the Herder brothers, who were sort of the interior decorators to the social elite, this newfound, the strata of newfound wealth that was emerging in New York. And he would produce it. That's just an incredible cabinet. It's more aesthetic era stylistically, but it's just a remarkable object. The Kimballs and the Herders were German. They were cabinet makers, and it's possible, although it's not specifically stated in anywhere, that when Christian Herder he made a trip to England to sponge up as many woodcarvers as he could find, about 250, in order to augment a group of 600 workers that eventually will work on and create the interior of the So it's possible that Kirchmayer was one of those woodcarvers, and that's how he came to the United States. The William Vanderbilt mansion on Fifth Avenue was this humongous pile just filled with all of this Herder brother interior decoration. And it's really the whole interior decorating field, decorating critics, sort of letting the rich people who had all this money that wanted to spend it know, which painting went with which couch. And that was the value added they brought to their, not just the cabinetry, not just the woodwork, but this additional knowledge and the sense of taste, actually, that they were helping the rich guys create. The inset here, the brown rectangle, is actually a part of the desk that's in the middle of the room. It was made specifically for William Vanderbilt, and that is the night sky, the constellation of stars that were in evidence on the night that he was born, William Vanderbilt. Nice, huh? Okay, Durham, I'm in trouble. I can't get my slide to advance.
Occasionally, if you unshare your screen and then reshare it, it should advance. Sometimes Zoom gets a little gummed up in advancing slides. So just reshare again.
Sorry, guys.
And are you able to advance it on your own machine or your own computer?
I'm on the computer. It's not advancing. Maybe Vanderbilt is jinxing me because I said bad things about him. There. Okay.
Yep. Sometimes there's a delay. Yeah.
This was a lovely quote, I thought, about from Arcangelo Cassieri, who was Kirchmayer's last apprentice. He knew Kirchmayer very well, started out as a young Italian immigrant working for peanuts in order to learn from the great man. And also he got cookies from Mrs. Kirchmayer, who I think had a soft spot for him. He talks about Kirchmayer's, the kind of characteristics of his art and his development of American Gothic. And Arcangelo Cassieri was a, he didn't die that long ago. He was a feature in the Boston art scene, architectural scene, quite renowned on his own, and also as a sculptor. And he had a studio in the Theodore Schwamb Mill in Arlington. Okay, it's happening again.
Doreen, are you using the arrows at the bottom by any chance? So you can reshare your screen, but also try using the right arrow at the bottom. See if that works. Rather than the mouse.
I'm not using my mouse, I'm using the right arrow.
Huh. We'll go. This sometimes happens, I think, with Zoom, that the slides stick in a PowerPoint. You could try getting out of presentation mode back to the normal mode and then go back to presentation mode.
Okay. Not doing that either.
Sounds like you've tried hitting the bottom arrow. Can you get out of presentation mode?
Not doing that either.
One issue may be that we've been sharing the screen. You're sharing it in presentation mode. So unshare your screen. So go down to share screen and then click it and unshare. And then go to your presentation on your own desktop there. And get out of presentation mode and then restart it in presentation mode. And maybe even go to the slide that you were hoping to be at.
Are people seeing it?
No, because you're not sharing now. Right now, you're just trying to get on your own screen where you wanted to be in the first.
I am now.
All right, so now try sharing again. At the bottom, share screen. Okay, we still don't, here we go. So, yep, there's your, I can see your desktop and your Kirchmayer, and then go and restart, go to the slideshow.
Yep.
And you could play from the current slide or from the start, I guess. Now you'll have to advance through.
Okay, sorry guys. Okay.
So
So
thanks, Doreen.
it was a transition because Kirchmayer at this point in his life leaves New York for Boston, and he joins the firm of Irving and Casson, which is the Boston parallel to Herder and Herder, a furniture cabinet making company that also provided home design, interior design, and eventually liturgical art as well. And they, at this point, had just moved to big new headquarters factory in East Cambridge, near the railroads, lots of workers coming in, lots of immigrant workers. And they had a very big concern. And Kirchmayer immediately was made head of the wood carving department. He was in charge of the wood carvers who made the woodwork for our beloved Robbins Library in Arlington. This showing two different slides. Probably the very mundane, repetitive work would have been sloughed off on one of the younger guys that he was training. I don't know if he would have been involved in making the more dramatic work that's at the top, sort of the capitals of those columns. There's no documentation that would let us know, but it does mean that every time you go to the Robbins Library, you might say hi to that woodwork and think of Johannes Kirchmayer. Now, I'd like to stop for a moment. This is on purpose, not because the slides went haywire, to take a bit of a breather and for us to think about why the heck the Baptist Church in Arlington, Massachusetts looks like a medieval castle with flying buttresses and that crenellation on top. And therein hangs a very long, complicated tale, which luckily some of the folks watching know much better than I, and maybe at the end we'll have time to do a better explanation than I can offer. But the origin of why the first Baptist church in, a Puritan town of Arlington, formed from Cambridge in 1630 after the Massachusetts Bay Colony, a dissenter church at that, why it would look like this. And the reason is, in England in the early 1800s, the Industrial Revolution hit. And it hits there much earlier. The same things that were happening that I described a little bit about Gilded Age America are happening in England 50, 75 years earlier. And it causes all of this societal upheaval and tumultuous times. And there are workers that are leaving their farms and going to work in factories that spew out soot and smoke and bad chemicals, and the poverty of the people is appalling. And furthermore, the Anglican Church is flaccid and flabby and probably corrupt. And so these young'uns at Cambridge and Oxford get very upset about that. And to remedy the situation, they're young idealists, like college students should be. They look to the past, to the back as far as medieval England, back when England was whole, when there was, peaceful peasants puttering about in the field and going to church for the grace of God, looked over by benign orders, the Franciscans and the Benedictines, in this peaceful, organic, whole society, going to church in Gothic style buildings that would have looked something like the Baptist Church in the middle of Arlington Center. So what do these young'uns think is going to solve the problem really then and get us back to that era? Architecture. So there is this big move in England, ends up being very successful, and Gothic church after Gothic church is built in or remodeled in England. And England also exports some of these architects, and in particular, Richard Upjohn comes to the United States and is very successful as a Gothic revival architect. And the next guy to take up the crown is Henry Vaughan, who is a much lauded, much copied, much admired Gothic revival architect. And it's the high Gothic that he's a particular proponent of, meaning those churches with those beautiful tall spires at the ends with the delicate tracery on the upper parts of the church. And Kirchmayer, he gloms onto Kirchmayer, and Kirchmayer, well, Harry Vaughan never glommed onto anyone. He was very reticent and very shy individual. But he sees the value of Kirchmayer's work, and Kirchmayer begins to have a wonderful new turn in his woodworking career in the United States. The next architect to take up the cause is Ralph Adams Cram. Ralph Adams Cram was a Renaissance man, wrong adjective, polyglot. He wrote books, he wrote poetry, he designed buildings. He was responsible for a whole slew of Gothic revival churches and of collegiate Gothic architecture, such as is so in evidence at, say, Princeton in Virginia, in Texas. I think there's a Wellesley building as well that was designed by Cram. And he and Kirchmayer began a very valuable and very long-lived partnership, and Cram very much appreciated Kirchmayer's skill. They worked on, originally, one of their first gigs was at Church of the Advent on Beacon Hill down on Brimmer Street. Neither one of them, Cram did not design it. He wasn't the architect, nor was Kirchmayer probably the most used woodworker in that particular church, but it started their partnership. And it probably bears fruit best if one looks at the All Saints Church in Ashmont in Boston. And there is Kirchmayer's wood carving there. If you can sort of look closely on the top of that, a tracery up above that with the wise men, the three men. Now, all of this work, much of this work, not all of it, was being done for, maybe spearheaded is a better word, for the Episcopalian Church in the United States. So in England, it's the Anglican Church, and in particular, the High Anglican Church, meaning the one that is most like the Catholic Church that they left, the one that is closest in terms of feeling that every single part of the church service essentially should be scripted and should have a meaning that has come down to us from God. And they're not at all loath to use the benefits of material wealth. In fact, the more, the better. So bring on the embroidered covers for the altar and the silver candlesticks and the stained glass windows and the censers that will have incense, and of course, and the pottery perhaps, and also of course woodworking, the beauty of holiness and the holiness of beauty. And in the United States, the Episcopalians, who are very similar to the Anglicans, as I've mentioned, the Anglo-Catholic version of Episcopalianism, are also the church of the emerging elite in the United States, those robber barons that are using the design services of the firms that we spoke about earlier. And they're also forming those schools, those prep schools that that the Episcopalian architects are designing churches for, such as Harry Vaughan. And it's to those schools they send their sons, who in turn will spew forth and become the best and the brightest and the elite in the United States. It might be interesting to note that the Episcopalians have provided 11 presidents of the United States, which is more than any other faith. So it was and also it's the case that in this particular point in American history, more and more churches are being built because the population's growing and because the nature of the settlement patterns are changing. In the old Boston, colonial Boston, say in the 1800s, people lived cheek by jowl with one another, rich person, poor person, medium person. But as the 1900s are dawning, the rich folk are moving a little bit further and further away from the less savory parts of Boston, and some of them are bursting forth into what we will term the suburbs. All of that meant that more and more churches had to be built. Great for architects. This was the last church that Kirchmayer and Cram worked on together. I think it's one of his loveliest. It's in Peterborough, New Hampshire, and it also has approachable Kirchmayer wood carvings. There's a sort of sense of humor sometimes to Kirchmayer's carvings. I think it's an evidence in some of the work that I saw at the Peterborough Church. Cram was very good at small churches, and we here in Arlington, we have St. Anne's over on Claremont Ave, which is an absolute treasure, the beautiful, beautiful church, and also the small chapel that he built for himself outside of Sudbury, Mass, which you can just stop. It's right on one of those roads that comes out of Sudbury, and you can climb up, and it's slightly in the woods, very lovely bucolic setting. Now, we've talked about the role of architecture in the reform of both the church and society, and now we should spend a little bit of time with two of the most important thinkers that give us the arts and crafts period. And I'm sure you all know that the arts and crafts period was not just about going to the neighborhood craft store and buying a potholder maker for your third grader. The arts and crafts period was a huge reform movement in the United States. It's not unlike the 60s. It's a lot of, just like you wouldn't say macrame potholders were the only thing that came out of the 60s or the most important part of it. It was a reform movement of everything from architecture, the built environment, a good built environment, a beautiful church would make for beautiful people, beautiful minds, but it was about music, it was about art, and it was about reform of the way people live their lives. And two of the biggest thinkers are John Ruskin and William Morris. John Ruskin, who lived a long and very productive and complicated life. And for him, this is a quote that might have merit since we're talking about a woodcarver. Because craftsmen took pleasure in their work, the Middle Ages, read Gothic, was a period of greatness. It produced the art of the common people. For Ruskin, he thought everything went really screwy at the Renaissance. Medieval power, great, the unified organic whole of a culture, and everyone was happy. It was a pious time when people worshiped God together in these beautiful Gothic 12th century cathedrals. And then in the Renaissance, people became selfish and arrogant, and the culture was downhill from there. For William Morris, yes, it was about design reform. Yes, he wanted people to have beautiful things. His very famous quote, "Have nothing that you do is not useful, do not know that is useful, or that you do not believe to be beautiful." But he also, an artist himself, he of course studied to be a Anglican minister, but then decided to become an artist, and then decided to be also to make beautiful things, including textiles, for which he is still known today. That's the strawberry thief pattern. My scarf contains it, which you probably can't see, which is still all over the place in museum gift shops. And to really find out how to do this, because he was, a artist, a minister, studied to be a minister, part of the elite, he went to a factory that was making wallpaper, and they were using aniline dyes, which have to be produced from, I think, oil or coal, that again were the after effects of making that particular product were just thrown into the river. So you ended up with a polluted environment. And the people, the men and women who were working, making this wallpaper were doing very laborious, very boring, same action over and over and over again for however many thousands of hours every day they had to work. So he soon began to realize that making beautiful things was not necessarily something that was beautiful for the people making them. And he soon turned to political activism and the socialism for which he is well known. And I guess if we have to have a tagline for Mr. Morris, it would be "Art is a political act." And just to let you know that not all of Ruskin was highfalutin. He also said, "One cannot be unhappy when one looks at a penguin." I think that's my favorite Ruskin quote. So all of this is in the air, just the way ideas are. You never know quite where an idea comes from, but there's a great deal of interaction between Boston on the Eastern Seaboard and England. Boston, Harvard grads are going for their grand tours to England, and different speakers are coming over from England to the United States. And in this ferment, in this joint belief that the industrial capitalist society is headed the wrong way and making ugly things and therefore ugly people, the first exhibition of the Arts and Crafts Society happened in Boston, Massachusetts in 1897. And although William Morris was newly dead, he did contribute some of his textiles to this actual exhibit, which I think is rather lovely. People had handmade jewelry, they exhibited silver bowls, they exhibited great, beautiful pottery. And Johannes Kirchmayer had one of his individual pieces exhibited in this first exhibit. As a result of this exhibit, the Boston Society of Arts and Crafts is formed. It's, if not the first, certainly the most important, earliest arts and crafts society. Its membership and its influence is way out of proportion to the actual people that you see there on the screen who are the charter members. In the first year, they had something like 70 members, and a decade later, there was something like 700 members. Charles Eliot Norton, who was a confidant of Ruskin, a good friend, was elected the first president of the Boston Society and also the first president of the National Society. And the folks in green are the architect or the educators who were the leaders of this organization, several of them at Harvard, one of them from MIT. And then the three dudes in blue are the actual working people who actually made things with their hands. Hugh Cairns and John Evans were stone people, stone sculptors, and of course, our Kirchmayer, who was a worker in wood. You might notice, and it's nice to see a woman on the screen, that women were strong participants in the society, in the arts and crafts movement. And this is some of their the tenets by which they worked, by which they their mission statement essentially. And you can certainly see the genetics of the arts and crafts movement from England that have made their way into the one from Boston. Motives of the true craftsman are the love of good and beautiful work as applied to useful service. The unit of labor should be an intelligent man whose ability is used and not subdivided for commercial purposes. None of that assembly line, Henry Ford kind of work. The developing of individual character in connection with artistic work and the raising of beauty in objects of use, which is of course just a restatement of William Morris's very famous dictum. So our hero, Johannes Kirchmayer, is sort of at the top of his game. He's achieved success, financial success in his woodworking career at Irving and Casson. He's rubbing shoulders with the intelligentsia in the Boston Arts and Crafts Society. He's being lauded in the press. He's being able to exhibit at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. And in 1896, he, at the age of 40, marries Frances LeClair, who was a French-Canadian immigrant, a waitress. And the two of them, he actually gets married twice, which if we have time at the end, we can talk about. They moved to the emerging community of Arlington Heights, has a bit of renown as an artist colony. And furthermore, they set up shop, set up home in 79 Crescent Hill Avenue, which is up on a hill. There was a magnificent western view. Maybe the Kirchmayers chose that because it reminded Kirchmayer of his Bavarian home. A bit of a stretch to think of Arlington, Massachusetts is akin to the Bavarian Alps, but at least they had a very nice sunset. And an intrepid reporter who climbed the hill to interview Kirchmayer talked about how the shrubbery was green, the grass was mown, and there were flowers everywhere, and it was a very artistic setting. The woodwork on the right is in that home even today, and it of course was done by Kirchmayer for his own enjoyment for his family. He also convinced his two younger brothers to come over. One of them stayed at the Kirchmayer home, and then 2 homes over, Kirchmayer actually built for Adalbert Zwink, his half stepbrother, his stepbrother, a home that's the only one, as Ed pointed out in his lecture a couple weeks ago. It actually looks like a German home. It has that Bavarian chalet outline to it, and Kirchmayer created the wood carving on the supports, the porch support. And then in the home itself, over the mantle, is a very intriguing and enigmatic piece of art that it has a texture almost of paper mache. It's some sort of, I don't know what, it's not wood, of almost a Spanish galleon looking entity crossing, or, fighting the waves. And, possibly it's a reference to the immigrant experience. Don't know. Adalbert Zwink actually had a woodworking career of note himself, worked a lot for the Carmelite order. The other, this might be new territory for you arts and crafts aficionados. Kirchmayer threw himself into the life of the Crescent Hill neighborhood. Small group of people, it wasn't a very large number. He helped support and helped build financially. He was a trustee. He was the first president of the Crescent Hill Club. They had a pool table. They had a ladies' room. They had rooms upstairs for new immigrant, perhaps workmen that were going to be at the Schwamb factory to live if they needed a place to stay for a while. They had whist parties. WHIST, the card game. They had dances, they had musical events. It was a really strong community center. But in addition, Kirchmayer, sort of drunk the arts and crafts Kool-Aid, and he tried to mold a certain portion of the club's activities to fit the Boston Arts and Crafts Society mission statement. He offered free hand drawing and modeling classes for the neighborhood kids. At the end of the term, there would be exhibitions of useful design art. The children were allowed to sell things in a sales room. And all of those elements were also part of the Boston Arts and Crafts Society in downtown Boston. There was a library, there were band and musical groups, dancing and singing classes. And the leadership of the club decided to offer a speaker series that had more serious topics than whist tournaments. And Hugh Cairns, one of the other 3 workmen, who was one of the founding members, charter members of the Boston Society of Arts and Crafts, came and spoke on architectural ornamentation. And as the intrepid Arlington Advocate reporter stated, Kirchmayer is doing much for young people in the way of good taste and a love for the beautiful. There were also numerous Schwambs who were involved with the Crescent Hill Club. These folks that maybe we can talk about a bit later, they're well known to Old Schwann Mill folk, but maybe not so much to other people. But there was no one smoking gun kind of entry in the gossip column about Arlington Heights in the Arlington Advocate, the local newspaper, that said something like, the Schwamb family had dinner with the Kirchmayers on Tuesday evening, and a dainty repast was served. So there isn't a definitive link that shows that Kirchmayer really had personal interactions with the Schwambs. It's hard to believe that they didn't. They German immigrants, they work with wood, and all of these events did happen at the Crescent Hill Club. Then in 1905, tragedy strikes. The Kirchmayers had adopted a child from Germany, And just before his second birthday, the little guy came down with meningitis and died. And this is his tombstone in Arlington's Mount Pleasant Cemetery, carved by his father, Johannes Kirchmayer. 1905 was a horrible year for Kirchmayer. He quit at Irving and Casson, probably, who knows, maybe the pain and horror of what happened in his personal life was part of it, but also there was very strained and unpleasant labor relations. Irving and Casson had an open shop and people wanted to unionize, and it just was a very unpleasant time at that particular business. And he joins up with the Ross Company, W.F. Ross Company, and he's a part owner. He's not just a worker. And they are yet another of the same sort of firm as the Herders and Irving and Casson, or the Davenport Company, all of them down there in East Arlington, East Cambridge. He continues to do great work and produce much woodwork for these churches that are continuing to be built. But in 1923, with the Ross Company, in 1923, his wife died. And after his wife died, Frances LeClair Kirchmayer, he also retired. He didn't quit carving. He continued to carve what he wanted to carve. And in particularly, he worked a lot for George Booth, who was a very wealthy newspaperman in Detroit, Michigan. And George Booth had made a fortune in the newspaper game, and he'd married even more money, so that there was a ton of money to be spent on this great, vast arts and craft venture that became the Cranbrook campus. It's a few miles outside of Detroit. It's over 300 acres. It features 2 private schools, a chapel, an art museum, a science center, and an arts and crafts house that the Booths built for themselves, and which you can tour if you're in the area. And Kirchmayer provided much of the decoration, including that overmantel that is there in the lower right. In the upper left is Christmas in Heaven, which is a piece that Booth, who was always a patron for Kirchmayer, had purchased earlier on. And Booth ends up donating that to the Detroit Institute of Arts, and it's still in their collection. Toward the end of his life, the Kirchmayers lived in Arlington. When they sold their Arlington property after the death of their son, and also they sold the community center as well, and sort of cut their ties physically, but they did not cut their ties emotionally. They still continued. They sold their property to their to family members, and that's why Shirley Prouty, who wrote the book about Kirchmayer, was a Arlington girl. It was her grandparents who lived in the Kirchmayer house, and certainly there must have been a great deal of congress between the two families, of interactions. But Kirchmayer and Frances moved from West Somerville, and after Frances died, Kirchmayer moves to a boarding house very close to work in East Cambridge. And a New York journalist makes the trek from New York to interview him. He's still a celebrity in arts circles. And the New Yorker is relatively sniffy about the environment that he has to go through to get to Kirchmayer's digs. It's squalor, it's tenement, it's filled with these foreigners. And he asks Kirchmayer, aren't you uncomfortable living in this? Isn't it dangerous? Don't you feel a bit scared? And Kirchmayer replied, I'm okay because I'm a carver of saints. Kirchmayer has one more chapter in his book. In 1929, he was of a mind to winter in Florida. New England winters, all of us understand why he would want to go to Florida for vacation. And he meets and marries a woman 30 years younger than himself, Burdette Colleen Bruna. And it's hard to find out very much about her. I think she was possibly worked at the inn he stayed at, or maybe she was a waitress at a restaurant that he frequented again. They come back to Cambridge, and he has prostate cancer and dies in 1930. After his death, his will is contested by his brothers because Kirchmayer had left his entire estate to this new wife, $30,000, and furthermore, all of his carvings and furniture, and except for the items that he said, if she doesn't want them, then they can go either to the Museum of Fine Arts or to the Detroit Institute of Arts. But there is a big brouhaha in the papers because here are Obergammerau passion play participants, Kirchmayer and his brothers, who are suing one another. It made for a great storyline. The brothers claimed that Kirchmayer was out of his mind when he made that will. And to prove that point, they brought forth several interesting accusations, or noted several interesting behaviors of Kirchmayer. They said that when after his first wife's death, he carved pictures of her, wood carvings of her, put them on the back of the kitchen chairs, and would talk to her for hours on end. I think that's kind of sweet, but to them that was evidence of an unbalanced mind. But the other points are a little more troublesome. Evidently, earlier in his life, Kirchmayer had a dog for whom he liked to play the mandolin, and he would play for hours. And at one point, he was playing the mandolin for his dog. He took out a gun, shot the dog, and then he turned the gun on his wife, Frances. And at that point, he was put in a sanitarium, don't know which one, and I don't know for how long. The last incident had to do with the later portion of his life after Frances's death. And evidently, Kirchmayer would frequent public dance halls, and he would claim that women were constantly following him, and this was causing him great distress. So the latter years of his life, or after his afterlife, were not as full of the good newspaper reports as were the earlier years. But to Ed's title that he gave us, I think that we can certainly say that Johannes Kirchmayer, master carver of Bavaria, and we can certainly proudly say, and Arlington. He had a memorial service after his death that would befit a founding member of the Boston Arts, the illustrious Boston Arts and Crafts Society. It was held at the Mount Auburn Cemetery, probably in the chapel there. And then his body was removed and buried in Arlington, which is where his gravestone is today. So my thank yous, and I will stop share. Okay.
Thanks very much, Doreen.
Thank you. Questions?
And I'll open this up for people to become visible here.
It was a fantastic lecture.
Yep.
It was wonderful.
Yeah, if my stupid computer would have cooperated. Sorry about that.
We're unmuted. Wonderful.
I have a question.
Yes.
Can you, I had to leave for a couple of minutes, so I apologize if you mentioned it, but can you talk a little bit about the types of wood that were used for carving?
His favorite was oak.
Oak, oh.
There's the piece that Booth bought was oak, for instance. It was like almost 5 or 6 feet tall and 2 or 3 feet wide and 4 inches thick.
Mm-hmm.
But he would carve with many different kinds of wood. Cherry, I think the German woodworkers used poplar, but I'm not sure that he used poplar. There is a quote from Cassieri, his Arcangelo Cassieri, in which he was working on a piece of wood, and he said, probably that the old man Kirchmayer would have sent this back because it wasn't, good enough. He was speaking about the decline in quality of the kind of wood that was available to craftsmen today versus what was available to Kirchmayer.
It's interesting that he liked that very hard oak. I mean, it's awfully hard to carve.
Well, as I'm sure all of you who've read Shirley Prouty's book know, the story that she relates is the way he would form a piece, that he would make a carving, because he was so highly trained and so highly gifted, is he would outline in charcoal the actual body of the saint that he was carving, make a figure drawing outline. And then he would, in colored chalk, perhaps, draw the draperies so that he wouldn't get mixed up when he went to carving. And then he was of a want to sort of turn the carving, and on the back of it, the wood that he was carving, on the back of it, he'd do a little practice piece, like he'd make a squirrel or an angel, and then he'd, slice it off with his chisel. And that let him know, that would inform him how deep he would go. I'm not a wood carver, so I don't know. But yeah, wood is hard. There's all sorts of different kinds of oak. There's red oak and white oak and European oak, all sorts of different kinds of oak. I guess one kind has sort of bubbles in it that Mr. Cassieri was talking about. Let someone who knows wood better.
Doreen, there's a question from Rob Davison and
Yep.
Andy Rubinson. Does the MFA have many of his pieces?
Is one. After all of that, after all of the craziness of the will. The piece was on display. I saw it a year or so ago. It was the child's, to call it a cradle is a bit of a misnomer because it's quite a large piece, bed that he made for Ralph Adams Cram. And it has angels, it's a 4-poster cradle. It has angels sort of on the corners of the piece, and elaborate carving and sort of a hood. And he made that and gifted Ralph Adams Cram with that particular piece. And Cram's grandchildren, I believe, donated it to the Museum of Fine Arts. Museum of Fine Arts has quite a good arts and crafts section. It used to be a whole section devoted to arts and crafts of the area.
And there's also a question from Colleen Cunningham. Did he carve the wood at St. Anne's in Arlington?
Did he what?
Did he carve the wood at St. Anne's in Arlington?
Oh, Colleen. We looked and looked and looked and looked. There's some documentary evidence that talks about carvers from Oberammergau, but not specifically that Kirchmayer carved anything. It seems very peculiar that he wouldn't have, but there's no definitive proof. I think Sarah Burks, I don't know if Sarah's on, we looked into that. After we wrote the book, we did a neighborhood tour of the different sites associated with Arlington's artistic culture, and we went to St. Anne's. A beautiful chapel inside. It's just filled with all sorts of lovely pieces of art and pieces of objects that were brought back from Europe that are embedded in the rock walls. Perhaps many of you know that it was actually funded partially by Isabella Stewart Gardner, who was an Episcopalian, and also she went to that Church of the Advent and was acquainted, great friend, I don't know, friend, but certainly knew Ralph Adams Cram and the Crowley brothers.
The Stations of the Cross. You have there the Stations of the Cross.
Yes, but
you have the Stations of the Cross.
They do, but
they are not.
Kirchmayer always signed his works with 4 strokes of the chisel, and that's what Mrs. Prouty and her family were on the hunt to find. That took them 10 years to aggregate the number of items that they have that they included in the book on him, is because they were looking for definitive proof that he had carved at something, and the definitive proof is his actual signature, and that is not in evidence that we could find at St. Anne's.
And from Stroker, we have a question as well.
What's that?
Joker asks if he ever did any work for any of the Masonic temples in the area.
For which temples?
Any of the Masonic temples.
Masonic? He was a Mason, but I don't know of any work that he did for the Masonic temples. He was involved with the carving of the cartouche on the above the stage in Arlington Town Hall, where we've all been. It's where I go to vote if I ever get to leave the house. And it's there's a great story because evidently it was when he was at which company was, maybe it was the Ross company, and evidently he had one of his apprentices or an associate was sort of working on the cartouche, that decorative element that's above the stage in the town hall, and it was Pellegrini, who was sort of a noted sculptor in the area. And Kirchmayer took one look at what Pellegrini was doing. It was too sort of delicate for Kirchmayer's taste, and sort of took the chisel out of his hand and paid him off for the day and sort of took over himself. So that's an Arlington related story, but I know nothing about Masonic temples that he worked on. He did work on, certainly on he worked on the Woburn Methuen, the music hall. That was a Searles Vaughan project. He designed the eagles for the Lars Anderson Bridge that we've all seen in our many forays into Boston. So he did work on buildings that were not churches.
Is there any other question?
Can you give us an idea how long it would take to do, pick a piece for someone who's never done it? It looks so detailed, so complicated. You could spend, forever doing one piece, but
He was seemingly indefatigable. He worked long, long hours, and he must have just, because he lived so close to either Irving and Casson or to the Ross Company, he would just sort of, I think, roll out of bed and, go over and work. The Herder and Herder, the big mansion, that took 3 or 4 years, but I don't know how much time, to extract the time that Kirchmayer would spend on something. He was not opposed, and American arts and crafts leadership was not opposed to the use of the machine for a certain portion of carving, because some of it is just very, very repetitive. And he thought merit in using the machine. The one piece we have of his own in his own voice is a brief article to that point. And there was merit in using a machine when the item being carved was mind-numbingly the same. And maybe for doing some of the initial roughing out, he'd use apprentices. They could get so far down, and then he would take over and have to do the finer work. But it would talk. I think there was some writing that I remember that someone came back a week later. They'd seen just this big block of wood that was in his kitchen in East Cambridge, sort of in a vise on the kitchen table, just sort of being blocked out. And then a week later, and they came back, and it had been carved down to sort of this exquisite figure. I don't know how long it would take though. He was a hard worker and a very productive worker and a very prolific worker.
Mm-hmm.
Another question, did his wife end up with the estate in the end, or any part of it?
Yeah, the second wife did. She got the $30,000 and as much of the woodwork as she wanted. You can trace her for several years. She continued to live at, Oxford Arms, which I looked up in Cambridge. It's sort of a nice, much nicer digs than Kirchmayer was in at the end of his life. She would go back and forth between Cambridge and Florida for vacations, but then that ceased. At least my ability to follow her in the Cambridge papers. And there's evidence that she got Social Security couple, maybe a decade later, but I couldn't even find a death certificate for her. But $30,000, this is the Depression, he dies in 1930. So I don't know, maybe if she was smart, it lasted long enough. It would have been a chunk of change in 1930.
Stroker asks how you got involved in doing all this research, which you may have explained a bit at the beginning, but you could recap that for him.
Yes. Arlington's claim to fame in the art department has always been Cyrus Dallin, and everybody knew we could lay claim to having had a great sculptor in our midst. But people, or historians in general, were not aware of Johannes Kirchmayer until the Historical Society talk was presented 12 years ago. I'm not exactly sure what date it was presented. And after that, it was a very intriguing lead for Amy and Sarah and myself when we were trying to repopulate the two sides of Arlington Heights. For folks that don't live locally, Arlington Heights, which is a section of Arlington that Kirchmayer lived in, has two parts to it, two hills that rise up from a stream that runs through them, and a road and a railroad as time went on. And each of these two halves, sort of butterfly-like, two wingspans of hills, ended up being home to a different, very interesting set of people. One that we sort of had coagulated around Dallin, the sculpture that we knew about, and the others that, as I've tried to indicate tonight, were organized a bit, not around Kirchmayer because he wasn't there that long, but for they could lay claim to having their own famous artistic person. The Crescent Hill neighborhood was actually started by not proponents of, but contributors to, and it's almost a, not utopian, but an idealistic notion of their own around community banks. They were high echelon labor people in the typographer union in Boston, which was a very influential union in Boston. And the movement for the 9-hour day was actually one of their accomplishments. And they also then were big proponents of and believers in and contributors to the community bank project. And that's how that particular half of Arlington Heights started. I have no evidence that Kirchmayer was a participant in that, although it's possible. I'm not sure I answered. I went off on a tangent, sorry.
Another question?
Did you mention where in Arlington his house is? If it's
79 Crescent Hill Avenue.
what again?
79 Crescent Hill Avenue.
Okay, thank
Very
you.
close to the mill.
79.
Doreen, do you know anything else about him socially from the Arlington newspapers?
Yes, from the, actually, Dermot, thank you for finding out that they were online. That helped a lot. I'd done a research the old-fashioned way using the microfilm in the library when we wrote the book, and had extracted most of the articles that contained references to him, but it was nice to have the online version, which is available now through the Lexington Library, because Lexington, back in that part of that era of the United States history, Lexington was sort of an adjunct to Arlington, not the other way around, which it seems like today. And the newspaper was owned, Parker was the editor of the Arlington Advocate and also of the Lexington paper, and it's sort of, do double dipping. He would have columns about people that lived closest to Lexington, which happened to be the Crescent Hill, Arlington Heights part of Arlington. So one could follow one could follow the Crescent Hill Club and a little bit of Kirchmayer and a lot about the Schwambs by going through those particular columns. Thank you, Dermot.
What was he, besides the Crescent Hill club that he created and built the house for, did he ever get involved in anything else socially in Arlington? Was he ever mentioned at parties?
An anomaly in his entire life. It was really remarkable, that whole Crescent Hill club activity. I might mention that there were a couple of huge 4th of July parades, because the 4th of July was huge in Arlington, perhaps all over, but in small town America. And Kirchmayer was on several committees for this big parade that sometimes the two sides of Arlington Heights would have parades that were almost in competition, but on one occasion they had one grand parade in which they cooperated. And in that particular parade, Cyrus Dallin marched in the 4th of July parade wearing a knight's armor, and Johannes Kirchmayer is listed in the newspaper article about it as being one of the organizers of the parade. He also was in another 4th of July parade in charge of the tug of war activity. No, he was not a social being. I mean, it's such an anomaly that the Crescent Hill Club era happened. And I think it's an insight that should be of note to people that study Johannes Kirchmayer. He did join the Masons, and there might have been some socialization that he did with them. He liked to go to movies later in life, and he drug a reporter along with him who was writing an article on him to go to the movies. And evidently he frequented music halls very, very late in life. One point that to me is another intriguing sort of, it's just out of character, is that he and Frances were first married in 1896, but then they got married again in 1898. And the second time they were married by a Swedenborgian minister in Cambridge. And it's just an interesting little cul-de-sac in John Kirchmayer's life. What the heck was that about? The only kind of, he did help decorate. He did do carvings for the Swedenborgian Church in Cambridge. And two of the leaders in the Boston Society of Arts and Crafts were Swedenborgian. So perhaps, if that's the right adjective, perhaps there's some connector there, but I don't know the rest of it.
It's probably the church that's still there at the corner of
Yeah.
Lindsay Street and Kirkland.
Yep.
Mhm.
Yeah.
By
But
Warren.
why would he get married a second time? I mean, he's just, his for people who've, almost every single article about him, whether it's academic or in a newspaper or in a journal, has something that's not borne out by the documentation that I've found. That is everything from his the date he's supposed to have come to the United States, when he came to Boston, what his role was in Europe before he came here. There's some sort of anomaly I don't know if he did it deliberately, if he just wasn't important to him because he was an artist and he wasn't a numbers guy, but there are lots and lots of discrepancies between the documentation proof and what I think John Kirchmayer told people.
Ed, thanks very much, Doreen, for your talk. And Ed,
I was supposed to be so tired. Sure.
Ed, could you perhaps give people an update on the old Schwamb mill and when we'll be open again?
Yep, we are reopening Saturday, April 3rd. Will be our regular visitation hours of 10 to 4. So we're open Saturdays and Tuesdays from 10 to 4. And we have a wonderful show up in the galleries in the spirit of the Dutch Golden Age, still life photography by the late Brian McGuire. And it's wonderful work, some of which was shown at the Copley Society on Newbury Street about 10 years ago. And he is inspired by the still life painting of not only the Dutch Golden Age, but the sort of parallel Spanish Golden Age as well. And it's really something to behold. And I really encourage people to come and see it. And our April talk, and I think Janet O'Riordan is on this Zoom program, but I believe it's Thursday, April 29th. I hope I have this right. It's the last Thursday in April, and it's going to be about gold leafing picture frames by a preeminent authority on that who was based in Washington, DC. That's the beauty of all this virtual stuff. You can go further afield to get William Adair, who will be our speaker, and he's also a client, a customer of the old Schwamb mill. So he's going to talk about the gold leaf process, and we're all really excited to have him be on the roster of programs.
Well, I think that with that in mind, then I say we'll say goodnight to people, and we'll see you for our next program in April.
Can I make a comment?
Yes.
I'd like to thank Doreen. I've worked with Boston Arts and Crafts for 30 years now, and there's so many stories and little threads that she brought out that really made him more human, and how important he was, etc. And the other thing is that with the maps and the addresses of East Cambridge, I really got excited with Otis Street and Cambridge Street and Thorndike and all that, because East Cambridge right now is under real pressure, development pressure, and they're trying to create a conservation district of that particular area, including Irving and Cason. And they're running into adamant opposition because other people want to be able to tear stuff down and build housing for Kendall Biotech. So keep your ears to the ground if you're interested in looking at East Cambridge Conservation District. Thank you.
Okay, folks. With that in mind, we'll say goodnight, and we'll see you for our next talk in April. And thanks again, Doreen. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Doreen.
Doreen. It's fascinating.
Thank you very much. Wonderful, wonderful.
Night.